Hello and welcome to the GZERO World Podcast. This is where you'll find extended versions of my interviews on public television. I'm Ian Bremmer, and today, what would a conflict between China and Taiwan actually look like? For years, the threat of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan has been the subject of war games and expert panels. Meanwhile, the People's Liberation Army has been conducting near daily military exercises around the island, and they're larger, louder, and more aggressive than ever before. In response, Taiwan's pro-independence president, William Lai, has pledged to boost defense spending and in March laid out 17 wide-ranging strategies to defend the island from Chinese infiltration. But Lai faces obstacles at home. Taiwan's government is divided. The opposition party, softer towards the mainland, controls the legislature, and any major decisions, especially ones involving national security, are tough to push through. The United States now finds itself in the difficult position of trying to deter Beijing without provoking a fight it doesn't want. And there's an open question about whether America would indeed defend Taiwan if it were attacked. The stakes are big. A war in the Strait would reshape the world economy, drag in major powers, potentially triggering the deadliest military conflict in the Asia-Pacific since World War II. So how far can China push? And how long can Taiwan hold out before a crisis becomes inevitable? To answer those questions, I'm joined by Bonny Lin. She's director of the China Power Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, one of Washington's top experts on Chinese foreign and defense policy. We discuss China's growing aggression in the Taiwan Strait, Beijing's goals, Taipei's options, and why the risk of conflict is getting higher every day. Let's get to it.
The GZERO World Podcast is brought to you by our lead sponsor, Prologis. Prologis helps businesses across the globe scale their supply chains with an expansive portfolio of logistics real estate and the only end-to-end solutions platform addressing the critical initiatives of global logistics today. Learn more at prologis.com.
Bonny Lin, welcome to GZERO World.
Thank you. Thank you for the invite, Ian. Really great to be here with you.
You've said that the risk of war with Taiwan is getting higher. Explain for our viewers just a little context of what you mean by that.
Sure. So as a baseline, I don't think there's a high risk of war right now in the Taiwan Strait. I think right now it's low or medium. But we are seeing more Chinese military preparations for war. We're seeing more antagonism from Beijing against the current Taiwan president, William Lai. And there's a lot more suspicion that William Lai will do more to push for Taiwan independence. There's been a lot of talk in DC about 2027, about how that's a date for when China will have military capabilities to invade Taiwan. That's definitely still there. That's still on Xi Jinping's mind. There's been no change in terms of Xi instructing his military to have the capabilities. But I think what worries my team also about 2027 is the end of 2027 is also the election for William Lai as he goes into his second term. So China is worried that Lai will be much more provocative in 2027.
Tell me what it feels like to be in Taiwan in this period of great geopolitical instability right now. How much is that reality pervasive in everyday life for just a Taiwanese citizen?
I guess I would say right now, everyday Taiwan citizen goes about his or her own life normally, right? There's probably more worry about what's happening on the tariff side than what we, at least in DC, would view as the near daily PLA threat against Taiwan. I don't think most Taiwan folks are worried about that on a day-to-day basis.
President Trump has come out and he said that TSMC, the global semiconductor company, is ripping Americans off. He has said that the Taiwanese don't spend enough money on defense. As with many allies of the United States, you could forgive the Taiwanese from thinking this guy isn't actually a friend of ours, isn't really going to protect us. Does that become, is it more pervasive than just the tariffs? Is there a broader concern about, is America really there for us?
I think there is some concern, as with any new administration, of what is the U.S. policy towards Taiwan. I think the contrast between President Trump and President Biden is not lost on within Taipei. So if you recall, during President Biden, he said on 4 different occasions that the United States would defend Taiwan. Then, of course, his team helped backtrack a little bit of that. But President Trump has kept it very vague, and I think that does generate some concern within Taipei. In terms of TSMC, there was also quite a bit of disappointment within Taipei because TSMC had made this significant announcement of investment and
in the U.S.
Right, exactly, in the United States. And then weeks later, Taiwan was still hit by 30+% tariffs. So there was some sense in Taipei, well, did the TSMC investment do anything? Right. So, but I think now they're recognizing this is not the Trump administration targeting Taiwan individually. Most U.S. allies and partners had some degree of tariffs. And around 36%, 34% isn't even that high compared to some of the other tariffs other allies and partners suffered.
So how would you say, if at all, has the change in administration affected policy in Taiwan?
I think there is, as with Taipei dealing with any new U.S. administration, it's trying to understand what is the U.S. policy towards Taiwan. There's also a desire to understand who will be driving that Taiwan policy, whether that's at the National Security Council, State Department, or Department of Defense. I think what I would say right now is Taiwan's current president, William Lai, has made it pretty clear in a variety of speeches as well as policy announcements that Taiwan recognizes that on the defense side needs to do more on its defense. He set a floor of 3% of GDP spending for defense. He also recognizes that economic issues very central to President Trump. So he has called for he's established most recently a sovereign wealth fund for Taiwan businesses to be able to invest more abroad, including investing in the United States. And he's also noted that Taiwan as a democracy will work with the United States and other democracies to try to construct a non-red supply chain.
I remember when on Liberation Day, all these countries around the world were hit with these tariffs. And as you say, a lot of them had higher levels than Taiwan. It was also interesting, of course, that it was a list of countries and Taiwan was listed as a country.
That's right.
It was a mistake, but did that have any impact on the ground?
I don't think so. I think it was welcomed at being listed as a country, but at the same time, I think Taipei would have preferred to not be on that list. I mean, Russia was not on that list, right?
Russia was not on that list.
Right.
That's true. Okay, now, William Lai is a comparatively new president. He represents the DPP, which is the more nationalist party in Taiwan. The Kuomintang, which has been traditionally oriented towards a more, let's say, softer relationship towards the mainland, controls the parliament. That's never easy. We've just seen that in South Korea, for example, driving massive challenges politically. How has that makes him, he's a weaker president as a consequence. He's constantly battling uphill just to get a budget done, to get any legislation done, to get defense support done. He says he wants to, get a lot more done, expand defense. But of course, the KMT is saying, no, you're spending too much. Talk a little bit about that dynamic and how that plays out in Taiwanese governance.
I would actually say the infighting that we're seeing within Taiwan's legislative yuan between the DPP and the KMT is probably the most intense we've seen in years. Because if you remember, under Lai's predecessor, Tsai Ing-wen, she didn't really have to deal with this issue of a very divided executive versus the legislative yuan. So what we're seeing is not only disagreements, which are normal in any divided government, but we're also seeing, for example, efforts to recall politicians, right? You're seeing the DPP trying to have different KMT politicians be recalled, and the KMT also trying to do recall on DPP politicians. In fact, in lead up to President Li's 1-year anniversary on May 20th, you also had the KMT trying to make an effort to recall President Li himself. So there's lots of tensions right now. And from my understanding, as looking from the outside from DC, it's making it very hard as to whether Li can pass any of the special budgets that we saw under President Tsai for defense. It's also making it more uncertain the extent to which any of Li's policy measures could easily pass because of all the pushback that he's getting from the KMT.
Does having a weaker political position make him more inclined towards nationalism, more inclined to make assertive statements and engage in assertive actions that could antagonize the mainland?
I think that's a very difficult question to answer because I think there's first the perception on the Chinese end, which is definitely yes. And then there is the measures that he will need to take to defend Taiwan, which could be perceived externally as efforts that could antagonize mainland. So for example, when you look at the 17 wide-ranging strategies that President Li announced in mid-March, a lot of the strategies were to push back against Chinese infiltration of Taiwan. So the statistics that Taiwan's NSB, so their intelligence agency, released in 2024, Taiwan convicted 63 or so folks for espionage on behalf of the PRC government. That is 3 times more than the conviction rate 3 years ago. So we know this is a rampant problem. But as a result of that, what Li wanted to do was implement a bunch of measures to protect the government, protect society, protect the military. Some of that includes, for example, making sure that those who are spouting pro-CCP propaganda
Chinese Communist Party, right?
Mm-hmm. Pro-Chinese Communist Party propaganda or messages are they have to be responsible for that. And if folks within the Taiwan government or Taiwan military travel to China, that has to be reported, that has to be known. So if you're the opposition party and you're opposing what President Li is doing, you could look at that as suppressing civil society, suppressing freedom of speech. So there is a way in which more political division within Taiwan could be perceived from China as contributing more to provocation from Li's end. Whereas from his perspective, he's trying to defend Taiwan. China could view that defense as as Li engaging in separatism or more pro-independence measures.
The GZERO World Podcast is brought to you by our lead sponsor, Prologis. Prologis helps businesses across the globe scale their supply chains with an expansive portfolio of logistics real estate and the only end-to-end solutions platform addressing the critical initiatives of global logistics today. Learn more at prologis.com.
Now, China itself, of course, has an economy that's only growing. The asymmetry in power between China and Taiwan is even greater than between India and Pakistan. It's even greater than between Israel and Iran. It's greater than between Russia and Ukraine. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, in a world where there's less global governance, in a world where there's more law of the jungle, this doesn't go well for Taiwan.
It does not.
Right? You don't have leverage. So absent leverage, what can Taiwan do? What should Taiwan do to help ensure that they continue to have the political future that they want?
So what Taiwan is doing right now is making sure that it has very strong relationships with the United States, with other democracies in the region. William Li is also trying to beef up Taiwan's defense throughout, both in terms of preventing Chinese infiltration, trying to increase Taiwan's defense spending. He's also trying to make sure that as Taiwan, particularly given the size of Taiwan's economy compared to China, that Taiwan is not as economically dependent on China as before. So basically a whole
So there's very little
measures.
new investment from Taiwan that's actually going into mainland China at this point.
That would be what President Lai would want, yes. But I think there is still quite a bit of investment because Taiwan had been investing in mainland China for quite a number of years, and it will take time before that investment really drops down to very low levels.
Do you think, again, you said that they're focused more on tariffs right now than they are focused on the PLA, but when we see the Chinese government engaging in more military exercises, live fire exercises, all the way around Taiwan, in Taiwanese airspace, Taiwanese waters, all of these things.
Right.
What's the reaction of the government to that?
Yeah.
What's the reaction of the president and of the opposition?
Right. So I don't think it's fair to say that the Taiwan government is more focused on tariffs versus the PLA. I think your average Taiwan citizen is probably more focused on tariffs because it affects their livelihood and it's more direct and concrete than daily PLA operations, which they're getting a little used to be honest.
Sure.
In terms of Chinese...
South Korea, same thing. I mean, you got these nukes right there and they live on the way they have to, right? So I get it. Yeah.
So in terms of Chinese exercises around Taiwan, so there's these large-scale exercises that China has been increasing the rate of. So since President Lai has been in power, so since January 2024, we've seen 3 large named Chinese exercises and a lot more smaller, not named and not announced Chinese military exercises. In terms of daily operations, we see Chinese aircraft and military vessels coming into Taiwan's self-identified air defense zone on a daily basis. And about once every 2 weeks or so, we see an elevated intrusion of both China's aircraft coordinated with China's vessels. So lots and lots of activity.
Compared to like a year ago, dramatically more.
Dramatically more. So in 2021, he said when China engaged in its large-scale summer exercises opposite of Taiwan involved 1 brigade of Chinese forces. 2022, it was 6 brigades. 2024, it became 42 brigades, of which over 100 Chinese naval vessels and 2/3 of China's amphibious fleet. So the scale went from 1 to 42 between 2021 to 2024.
2/3 of China's amphibious fleet involved in a single set of exercises around Taiwan.
Yes. And I think sometimes those figures are lost because we constantly hear about these Chinese military activities, but the rate and pace of Chinese activities around Taiwan has been increasing quite a bit.
As has their military spend.
Yes, yes. I would also note that this year there has been some alarming military developments that we've seen. So we saw China showcase 2 mobile bridges that would basically allow China not only to leverage the People's Liberation Army Navy, but also, as you know, China leads in shipbuilding. So they have lots of large container ships, lots of cargo ships, lots of roll-on, roll-off ferries. So these 2 mobile bridges will allow China to use its commercial ships and to bring heavy assets onto Taiwan. We also saw this year...
So it's preparing for a potential amphibious assault. They want everyone to know they can do that.
That's right. China is also constructing a very massive, large underground facility near Beijing. And this was recently revealed in some of the news articles this year, too. So lots and lots of developments that are showcasing that China is very dead serious about using military force if they need to.
How is the Taiwanese government responding to that?
So obviously it's a daunting challenge for any government, whether we have a DPP president or a KMT president. So William Lai, the current president, is responding through a variety of measures. He's responding by building up Taiwan's military capabilities, increasing Taiwan's military spending, increasing Taiwan's military training too. So for example, just in the past week, we've seen a number of Taiwan military exercises. And we're also seeing that as China engages in large-scale military exercises or activities around Taiwan, Taiwan is now reacting and engaging in exercise around the same time to use those Chinese provocations as an opportunity to exercise Taiwan's military. There's been also quite a bit of focus on civil defense, basically getting the Taiwan people ready to fight because they recognize in an actual Chinese invasion or a large-scale contingency, the Taiwan people have to be ready. It's not sufficient just to have the Taiwan army or Taiwan military ready.
Hong Kong, of course, had an autonomous political system. They don't anymore.
Right.
What makes Taiwan different, if anything?
I think a major difference is that Hong Kong never had its own separate military. Taiwan has its own separate military. And also the difference is Hong Kong is connected to mainland China by land, whereas within Taiwan, these Taiwan Strait creates a separation to the extent that regardless of how capable you assess the Chinese military, most would say that a Chinese amphibious invasion of Taiwan will be the most complex military operation we've ever seen in history, more complex than the Normandy invasion, right? So there's a sense within Taiwan that yes, China's military capabilities are increasing, China's economic power is increasing. There's a whole range of levers that Beijing could use against Taiwan, but they have the advantage of the defense. And if Taiwan can invest enough to build up its capabilities and have U.S. allies and partners come to Taiwan's defense, Taiwan should be able to either deter China from engaging those operations to begin with, or make such an operation sufficiently complex and uncertain that even China can't be confident that it can be successful in amphibious invasion.
The Chinese government has long said that the integration of Taiwan into the PRC is not only a priority, but an inevitability.
That's right.
I understand that the Taiwanese government doesn't accept that, but is there a growing fear, even a growing realization that even if you don't accept it, that's the future that is in store?
I don't think folks within Taiwan believe it's inevitable. Even within Washington, D.C., I don't think we believe it's inevitable, mainly because how complex the operation is. And also, I think when folks talk about how difficult the military operation is, I think we also forget that if China were to invade Taiwan, there will be tremendous economic consequences that China would have to bear. What I often hear from the people in Taipei is the people who make up the Chinese People Liberation Army, many of them are men, many of them are only children, right? So it would be a significant loss to China if it were to engage in such an operation because of how deadly it would be on its population. And China has been looking quite a bit at what are its lessons learned from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And if China were to invade Taiwan, Beijing is expecting massive sanctions to the extent maybe even more than what we levied against Russia. And so the entire operation is not just a military calculation, but will have significant economic and financial consequences too.
So, I mean, the political pressure, the economic pressure, and the obvious military focus from China all orients towards, we want this place.
That's right.
Short of invasion, what do you believe the Chinese are trying to accomplish?
So I think the ultimate Chinese goal is first to prevent independence, and when possible, and definitely before 2049, basically the centennial anniversary of the
CCP.
Of the founding of China, to have unification. But there's actually quite a bit of debate in China what actually is unification and what are the conditions that could be offered to Taiwan as part of unification. Prior to Hong Kong, some of the requirements for unification were actually a little bit more lenient for Taiwan. They included, for example, prior Chinese leaders even allowing Taiwan to maintain its own military. I think now, given all Beijing saw with the opposition within Hong Kong, the protests, there's probably less of a desire to allow Taiwan to have its own military. But there should be some recognition, at least among Taipei, that Taiwan is part of China. So I think if China were to really move forward on unification, we would actually, short of an invasion, right, we could see...
If there was a political willingness of Taiwan to go along with this.
Right.
Yeah.
We could see a variety of formulations in which you could see a leadership in Beijing saying, well, that isn't exactly the way we control Hong Kong or some of the other special zones or provinces within Beijing, but that could satisfy our criteria for unification. But below an invasion threshold, China has other options for unification with Taiwan. A blockade,
for example,
is a very
where they
possible operation.
Inspect ships, for example, coming in.
So the blockade, the way we define it at CSIS, at least my team, would be led by the People's Liberation Army Navy. It would largely involve kinetic strikes on the island first, and then basically preventing air and maritime traffic from reaching the island. Short of a blockade, there's also the option of China using its Coast Guard, which is generally viewed by the outside world as a law enforcement asset, but is really an extension of the People's Liberation Army. The Coast Guard could form a customs inspection zone around Taiwan, basically achieving the same effect of preventing traffic into Taiwan, but not using PLA assets. As you know, a blockade is viewed as an act of war, whereas a custom inspection is not viewed as an act of war. There are lots of different ways that China could force Taiwan or put more pressure on Taiwan short of an invasion.
And can you imagine, were the Chinese to start inching up that escalatory ramp? And again, we've already seen some of those precursors over the past months and years.
Right.
Do you see a potential future Taiwanese government under domestic political pressure that would say, okay, we're willing to talk about what reunification might mean short of we give up all of our rights? Do you think that's possible?
Not until Taiwan's been under duress for quite some time. The public opinion polls in Taiwan show more and more Taiwan population either satisfied with the status quo or against unification. And that's been a trend that we've seen for decades. We saw a jump in the sentiment against unification after Hong Kong. So that said, though, as you know, when faced with a much more imminent threat, and if, for example, they're under a blockade or under a quarantine where their daily lives are being impacted, I think there is a possibility that those sentiments could change.
I mean, like if you were in Beijing and your intention was, I got to find a way by 2049 to ensure that these guys are actually, under my authority, this is what you would be recommending they do.
I'm not sure I would necessarily be very good at advising what the Chinese government on what they could be doing, but I do think...
You might surprise yourself. You never know.
I do think their underlying strategy of increasing China's power vis-a-vis Taiwan does give it advantage. So China's military power, economic power, political power. I think where Beijing falls short is Beijing's efforts to reach out towards the Taiwan public, Beijing's efforts to win the hearts and minds of the Taiwan public, that they are falling way short on that. So yes, they have the capabilities, but they're not getting any of the love from the Taiwan people. In fact, they're pushing the Taiwan people away from them more and more.
Now, the U.S. relationship with China famously is absent trust right now, and that's not a new development, but it gets better and worse. Mm-hmm. It's not in one of its better phases right now. There's a move towards a greater decoupling between the U.S. and China economically. We have all these export controls, including on semiconductors, very important for Taiwan. Mm-hmm. Is a better relationship between the U.S. and China good or bad for Taiwan, and why?
I think when the United States has a really good relationship with China, there are probably concerns in Taipei that Washington may not be willing to support Taiwan as much because of the really good relationship with China. There's also a sense that if China has a really good relationship with Washington, that maybe China is less worried about Washington supporting Taiwan, so maybe China doesn't need to put as much pressure on Taiwan. So it really comes down to what exactly, where these two balances are. So for example, I think there was some anxiety in Taipei when we saw the results of the recent U.S.-China tariff negotiations, right? How before it was 145 and then it came back and both sides went down with their tariffs. So I think sitting in Taipei, they might be wondering, well, what does this mean? Is the United States now seeking a somewhat better relationship with China? And what does that mean in terms of thinking through the implications for Taipei? So it raises lots of questions. I don't think it necessarily says the direction of China's policies towards Taiwan will go one way or the other.
Does Taiwan generally have better relationships with the hawks in Washington in terms of their views towards mainland China?
I would think so. I think there's probably generally more alignment that China is problematic, China is an authoritarian actor, China is an aggressor with the hawks in D.C. But I would say throughout D.C., there's a bipartisan support for Taiwan. And that doesn't matter whether you are a hawk or whether you're a Democrat or whether you're a Republican.
On the other hand, you have this tendency of, we don't want wars, not our problem.
Right.
Europe, you take care of Ukraine. Taiwan, you take care of yourself. Which of those two is more present in Taiwanese thinking about Washington right now? Which do you worry about more? Which do you think is more important?
So I think Taipei definitely hopes the first category is more dominant.
But do you believe that?
At the end of the day, when it comes to the defense of Taiwan, the responsibility and the decision will be made by President Trump. And it seems pretty clear to me that President Trump does not like wars, has prided himself in stopping wars and avoiding wars. But at the same time, even during the first Trump administration, we saw that President Trump was always friendly with authoritarian governments while his team was very hawkish against them. So in some ways, he plays the good cop when it comes to dealing with these authoritarian governments. So I think it would be a miscalculation on China's end if they view some of the rhetoric President Trump has been using towards China as meaning that President Trump has affinity towards China. And I think that's something that Taipei does recognize, that at the end of the day, despite what President Trump might be saying about China, might be saying about Xi Jinping as his friend, the United States is set on competition with China.
Now, does Taipei, do they really like it when a whole bunch of senior leaders, come over, engage with them, or would they rather stay off the headlines because they know that antagonizes mainland China?
So under President Tsai Ing-wen, there was somewhat of a balance between them. In the sense that there was a recognition that when then Speaker Pelosi went to Taiwan in 2022...
Caused trouble.
Yeah, it caused China to engage in this massive exercise. And then afterwards, almost every year, we've seen a massive Chinese military exercise around
So
Taiwan.
arguably, you would have been better off in Taiwan if she had never gone.
I'm not trying to say that, because her setting foot on Taiwan showcased U.S. support for Taiwan. But I think what the sentiment has been since 2022 is, to be honest, within Taipei, this is my understanding, particularly among the DPP, is that regardless of what Taipei does and what the United States does, China will always find excuses to escalate more against Taiwan. So even if you have a congressional delegation or if you don't have them, I think there's more of an assessment in Taipei as well as in DC, particularly under the Trump administration too, that China will just keep on finding these excuses to escalate. So there's almost a downplaying of any assessment that these visits themselves could be triggering of China.
Of course, there's a lot of nationalism in Taiwan. There's a lot of desire to have self-determination, to be able to determine your own system.
Right.
China, on the other hand, has gone through almost 50 years of unprecedented growth. Their model clearly has had success. They have world-changing technologies. Is there a growing number of young people in Taiwan that are looking with China with a sense of ambition and saying, well, maybe we should be a part of that?
I don't think so. I think the young people in Taiwan look to the United States, to Japan, to Europe, and they want to come here.
Bonny Lin, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Ian.
That's it for today's edition of the GZERO World Podcast. Do you like what you heard? Of course you do. Why not make it official? Why don't you rate and review GZERO World? 5 stars, only 5 stars, otherwise don't do it. On Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Tell your friends.
The GZERO World Podcast is brought to you by our lead sponsor, Prologis. Prologis helps businesses across the globe scale their supply chains with an expansive portfolio of logistics real estate and the only end-to-end solutions platform addressing the critical initiatives of global logistics today. Learn more at prologis.com.